We're going to come up to our question, which is about, of course, Michael Gove redefining, or defining, if you like, extremism today. But a few preemptive words about what he said. And my feeling is that this intervention will probably cause more problems than it solves.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but I think, look, clearly extremism needed to be tackled. We've all seen the upsurge in extremism on our streets, particularly since the Gaza crisis has emerged, and the Hamas terrorist attacks and how that has played out. Something had to be done, and I think the government, was right to have a crack at this. But I am concerned, as you've just pointed out, Kev, that this definition perhaps falls between two stools. And it falls on the one hand because there's a lot of interpretation required in it. So that requires third parties to interpret. And that means that you might not catch the people we all know are extremists in this country, the Islamists and the far right, because they might be interpreted out of it somehow by the third party people.
This new definition will apply but not criminalise groups that promote an ideology based on violence, hatred or intolerance. I find the violence bit a bit strange, because surely if you are promoting violence, that is a crime. As I was saying to Alex earlier, I'm an absolutist on free speech. I don't buy all this stuff about language is very important. It's our language. We can use it. If it offends people, hey, suck it up. However, if the language you are using is a call to inflict harm on other people, obviously the law has to come in there. You can't have that. So I'm a bit dubious about this violence bit. Hatred and intolerance, I think we have to accept. That's not necessarily a crime, to hate or be intolerant. But on a more general basis, Alan, do you fear that this new definition may infringe on freedom of speech?
Well, it might do. I think, Michael Gove has rightly said, I don't intend it to. This is my plan, is to preserve free speech and to put this out in definitional form that I think will protect it. But it's interesting. You talk about hatred and intolerance, for example. Well, your version of hatred and intolerance might be different to mine, or might be different to the third person's. What if the person doing the interpretation believes that this show is promoting hatred and intolerance, for example, and will say that it's on every day, there's a repeat pattern, and hateful views are expressed in this point? In theory, at least, you can see a situation where the label of extremism could be put on this show, for example, or many other people unintentionally caught in. And that, I think, is a problem with woolly phrases. Violence, we all understand. We get violence because it's either violent or it isn't. There's no real midway. Hatred and intolerance are subjective criteria. There are other things in the definition. That you look at, fundamental rights, for example. What are these fundamental rights? I mean, I'm curious what those are. Yes. So definitionally, what are they? And if we don't understand what they are, can they be reinterpreted? Let's imagine a different government came in with a different view on these things. Will that new centre of excellence, therefore, change its criteria for interpretation to look at this? So I'm worried that, number one, we're going to miss out on some of the groups now because there's going to be wrangling about the interpretation. I'm also worried that down the line, there will be a different set of criteria applied to the interpretation, and the whole definition could become a political hostage.
And do you think this could be, perhaps Charlotte, you can think about this as well, but you first, Alan, is this going to end up being a field day for lawyers? Because if you bring some alleged terrorist into the dock...
Every day's a field day for lawyers.
Yeah, but of course. But you bring a terrorist, an alleged terrorist into the dock, and the prosecutors go, you are guilty of hatred, you are guilty of intolerance. The lawyer's saying, well, what is hatred? What do you hate? How can you define it? The lawyers are going to do well out of this, aren't they?
Well, we've already seen that's likely because, we've been told that the Secretary of State's view is final on this subject, but there will be judicial review possibilities. If the whole thing gets ruled ultra vires, that's a massive blow for the government, number one. Number two, I should point out there are, of course, dangers in the groups taking the case to court. If it is confirmed in law, for example, that they are extremist, that becomes a much bigger problem for them. Right now, there's this sort of grey area, isn't it? Well, the government says you're extremist. Well, the next government might change its mind on that. But if it's defined in law that you then fail, well, then, frankly, you are going to be labelled as extremist. So I think that does work both ways, but the lawyers win either way. They get their day in court.
Alan, I want to come back to a conversation we were having off-air, which is a bit naughty of me, but we were talking about the sort of measures being adopted in France right now. They've gone as far as banning banning the marches, saying, look, we know that they've got connections to some organisations with some very unsavoury relationships. And so these marches are no longer taking place. They're going even further when it comes to monitoring activities within mosques, so on and so forth. We're going one step in the right direction, saying, well, look, if you're a dodgy organisation, you shouldn't be telling the police what is Islamophobia and not. But do we need to go, say, to French levels now of actually, really taking the bull by the horns, even if it does risk offending people?
Well, to just carry on where Charlotte was going with this, what is certainly true is that this definition is not a strategy to defeat extremism. And to be fair, it's not supposed to be. It is simply a very small chunk of a much larger strategy that needs to be done and put into place, and things that I think Kev was alluding to at the start by, should police be empowered more? How do we work in that kind of way? And certainly, if you think of what the Prime Minister was saying, a couple of Fridays ago, this is not the answer to what he was saying, that the country is being swept by extremism, and here is our definition that will solve the... This is not the answer, and that's not what it's supposed to be. So how are we going to move forward on the broader question is something we need to be asking ourselves. It is quite clear that the marches, for example, you highlight the French example, the marches have gone on, long enough in terms of what's happening, and have been aggressive enough that we should be taking action against them, basically. That has to happen right here and right now, as one setting an example. Equally, people who, manifestly hate the country, we should be doing something about that. Look, there is freedom of speech. No one's saying you can't say these things, but there's also consequences for actions. And for example, there was an imam recently who called the French flag satanic. And the French reaction was very stunning.
Kicked him out
they kicked him out the country.
Off you go, yeah.
It's quite amazing.
Been there 20 years.
Had family,
but that's
who
what's
cares?
extraordinary about the way that we think of the continental Europeans as weak on these subjects. Actually, they've turned out to be quite strong on some of these social cohesion issues and extremism issues, and we probably need to take a leaf out of their book.
This is probably a characteristically shallow observation on my part, sir, but why do you think Michael Gove went out of his way to say that his definition of extremism doesn't apply to trans groups? It could, couldn't it?
Well, but here's the point. It could. Michael Gove says it doesn't apply to it, but as I've just said, the interpretation might mean it could do. And again, other people, the very fact you're asking it, saying, actually, I think trans groups might cover that. Well, what if down the line people decide that they do? Well, then Michael Gove's statement is wrong, isn't it? Yeah. Because the problem with interpretation, as always, is if you leave it to an unclear definition and things aren't very hardly defined, violence, for example, or overturning the British state. Now, under those terms, by the way, the trans activists would not be deemed as extremists. But if you bring in hatred and intolerance, we've seen some of the hatred that people like J.K. Rowling's had and other things from and that's possible. Equally, someone could say a religious Christian who wants to ban abortion, that's hatred.
Yes,
but
yes.
It's interpretation, isn't it?
Yeah, because some of the activities of the trans groups, you could certainly argue they have infringed on the freedoms of others. So
Correct.
This is going to be the problem with this definition, isn't it?
It strikes me that what we have is a situation here where we're saying what taxpayers' money aren't going to go to organisations who shouldn't be receiving it and they shouldn't have positions of power. But a lot of the most unsavoury organisations get a lot of foreign funding. And we've seen plenty of hate preachers just flagrantly putting their sermons on YouTube, appearing in mosques all around the country. I mean, this doesn't touch them, does it? This isn't going to affect any of that.
This, again, because there is simply a definition of extremism when it comes to the government dealing with people, none of what you've suggested will be touched by this. So, as I said, the question is, there is a small plank in a much larger strategy, and we've yet to see that larger strategy enacted. The PM said this was a major problem. Well, here's a little step in the right direction, at least in doing something, but it isn't the be-all and end-all, and if it is, then that cannot be a sensible outcome from what the PM was suggesting was a massive national crisis.